reserves onshore? Are they moving heavily into offshore drilling? Now, if it's 5, 10, 50 times more expensive to drill offshore than on land, doesn't that tell you that Saudi Arabia knows they've got no more oil to find? It's axiomatic that if Saudi Arabia has passed its peak and is in decline, the whole planet is, just because of the size of the reserves that are there. Iraq is oil that's not only accessible, it's right close to the Persian Gulf, which means it's a short distance to ships. They can put the pipelines, they can get that into the global supply stream as everything else declines. And Iraq was all about the oil. You know, a lot of people have admitted that, and like, duh. 11 days after 9/11, when there was no clear evidence that Saddam Hussein had anything to do with 9/11, of course he didn't, that the plans were started to invade Iraq, of course. That was the objective. Get control of that oil. Because Saddam Hussein had been talking about pricing his oil in euros, taking it away from the dollar. We got in there, we restructured everything, we put in a friendly government using the US dollar, and we assured the oil companies their quote-unquote fair access and fair share of Iraqi oil. We have no intention of leaving Iraq. We're never going to leave Iraq. Going back to 2004, we started building the largest, most permanent military bases, 3 of them in the world, plus the largest embassy compound that's ever been built. We built an embassy compound in Baghdad that's bigger than Vatican City. That's not a temporary deal. Nobody's going to take that oil, but we are sitting on it. But there is not enough oil in Iraq to change anything. Iraq probably has around 90 billion barrels of recoverable oil. That sounds like a lot of oil. But when you consider that in 2008 the world was consuming 85 million barrels a day, that means 1 billion barrels of oil only lasts for about 11 and a half days, so that ain't that much oil.
It's only the first of the good things that will come to Iraq, thanks to oil.
They knew exactly what was coming. That's what's in the National Energy Policy Development Group report that's been classified, because if that report were declassified, we would be building scaffolds to hang Dick Cheney and everybody in that administration tomorrow. Let's assume, just for the sake of discussion, that there's 600 billion barrels in the Arctic. First of all, it happens to be under the polar ice cap. That's a problem. The polar ice cap happens to be on, what, 10, 15,000 feet of water. The problem with the polar ice cap is it floats, it moves. So you can't drill a well on Tuesday and expect it to be in the same place on Thursday. That's why a lot of conservative think tanks and oil companies are cheering the melting of the polar ice caps.
Developing this tiny section of Anwar, eventually build up to a million.
If there is oil in Anwar, there's no more than about a 6-month supply for the entire United States. There are no pipelines across 1,000 miles of tundra that's melting due to global warming, which means you can't sink pipes to support a pipeline in tundra that's turned to mud. There's no tanker routes. The wells aren't drilled, and yet we are spending our future as if that oil is there. We got to drop all this lying right now. If we don't need transparency about anything other than about how much oil is really left, because we don't know. Oil is a commodity, it's an asset. You make loans based upon what's in the ground. So you have all these accounting terms. Possible reserves, proven reserves, ultimately recoverable reserves, verified reserves, estimated, but actual reserve estimates are state secrets. The Saudis don't dare announce that they've passed their peak of oil production. Why? They have a very restive population that have been sold in expectation of a rising standard of living, and the moment Saudi Arabia acknowledges its past peak, it may well have a revolution. Now, what happens if there's a revolution in Saudi Arabia with 25% of the world's known oil? Where's that oil going to get replaced from? It can't be. Very complex problem. It's a very complex situation.
Just start working now, otherwise we won't have time. We're going to be out of oil within a few years.
In doing this sort of pulling archival footage for this film, I found at least 10 examples of people in the late 70s talking about this is the end of oil. This is like end of a way of life. We're hitting a new era.
This situation is destined to continue.
People look at that footage and I think that they can feel that it's somewhat alarmist, given that we were able to continue our way of life for another 30, 35 years. Do you see any parallels between that time and now?
The 70s was really a critical decade. In the 70s, Marion King Hubbard, the original prophet of peak oil, in late 1949, he did the math. It said U.S. domestic oil production will peak in 1970. So that's not some feat of Nostradamus communicating with some entity. It's math, it's science, it's simple. But in the 70s, M. King Hubbard testified before Congress. That was 1974. In 1976, President Jimmy Carter said, man, we cannot use as much energy as we have been using.
To use energy more efficiently.
That's when solar panels went up. That's when he started. He knew. They have known in Washington. I have published on my website, as have others, declassified CIA documents from 1976 showing that CIA was perfectly aware of peak oil. In those days, of course, when the situation appeared to be normal, when people had jobs, they had vacations, they had credit cards, they had credit lines, everybody's talking about growth, 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 buy, spend, consume, consume, and everything seemed to be working. Yeah, we were called alarmists. We don't live in that world anymore.
Americans were on the way to owning millions of cars.
800 million internal combustion powered vehicles on the planet. They all run on oil. It takes uncounted barrels of oil to make those cars and engines in the first place. And you cannot plug any new technology into an internal combustion powered engine. With 7 gallons of oil in every tire, nobody will ever make 800 million new internal combustion anything because there ain't going to be enough oil. Ethanol is an absolute joke. First of all, a very brilliant scientist, David Pimentel, took the concept of net energy. How much energy do you invest versus how much do you get in return? And he concluded about a decade ago, I guess, that it takes more energy to make ethanol than you get from burning it, which is absolute stupidity. Because you drive the oil-powered machines, et cetera, you irrigate, you use the fertilizers, you're burning all that oil and natural gas to grow it. Then you make steam, which is more hydrocarbon energy, you add more chemicals, and you come up with ethanol, which you can put in a car. Now, the Bush administration had announced a goal of having 15% of all fuel in the United States made from ethanol, I think by the year 2015. They forgot to tell you that that would take all the arable land used to grow corn to do it. Canadian tar sands is an oil. It is a very, very thick, sticky, obnoxious substance that's mixed in with sand at levels 200, 300, 400, 500 feet in layers beneath the soil. This is in Alberta. And they literally strip mine thousands of tons a day. They put them in these huge oil-powered dump trucks and drive them to a place where they then wash the sand. They take millions and billions of gallons of fresh water, which we're running out of everywhere, and they boil it by burning natural gas. There is not a possibility anywhere that Canadian tar sands production will exceed maybe 3.5 million barrels a day. The first thing that the uneducated mind that's in denial says, well, what about hydrogen? Can't we make electric cars? And I have to bring them back to the fact that there's 7 gallons of oil in every tire, that there are thousands of gallons of oil in every car, in the plastics, the paints, the resins, everything, all of that's made by oil, the oil that's used to manufacture the car and ship it around to heat the metals, et cetera, et cetera. There will never be 800 million electric-powered vehicles, and electricity is not an energy source. The electricity is generated by burning or using some other kind of energy. It's clear that electricity is the key to industrial civilization in that it powers our refrigeration. It runs the water pumps that pump water out of the New York subway system every day. It allows us to commute electronically, charge our cell phone batteries, preserve food, run operating rooms, etc. The subject of alternative energies. There is no such thing as clean coal, and there never, ever will be. Why? Carbon sequestration is enormously expensive. What it says is essentially as you capture the CO2 and any other greenhouse gases emitted, in the burning of the coal, you exert enormous amounts of energy to compress it, then you move it over enormously long distances, and you pump it into some airtight chamber in the ground where somebody will figure out with technology what to do with the greenhouse gas in 10 or 15,000 years. Nuclear process requires something like 10 to 13 years of incubation to get the permitting done, all the regulations satisfied, and the construction of nuclear power plants is one of the most energy-intensive processes in the world. The steel, the lead containment, the enrichment of uranium is a horribly intensive process. You just don't throw a rock of uranium in and start making nuclear energy. Can't do that. The first and obvious problem with tidal energy is that it has to be generated or collected near a coastline. Salt water is extremely corrosive. There's an enormous net energy cost in manufacturing the machines. There are only two alternative energies which can really have